Hello, and welcome to this bite-sized guide to the proposed new climate change regulations for occupational pension schemes. My name's Andy Lewis, and I'm a partner in the pension sector group here at Travers Smith. Our team has been looking carefully at these proposals since they were first announced last year. We think they're potentially significant and that complying with them could potentially be a heavy lift for some schemes. In this webcast, you'll hear from lawyers across the Travers Smith pension sector group about key aspects of the proposals. This is part one, and here we're going to look at the context of the regulations, the proposals for their timing and scope, and the proposed ongoing duties that they will impose around governance, strategy and risk management. And finally, we'll wrap up with a brief look at how TCFD duties are being introduced in the wider economy. And then in part two, we'll look at the more specific proposals for trustees to carry out scenario analysis and set metrics and targets around climate change. I hope you find this interesting. So without further ado, let's begin by setting these regulations into context. The basic idea here is to introduce a new set of statutory duties for occupational pension scheme trustees. These new duties will be based on the principles set out by an international initiative known as the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD. Broadly, TCFD is a set of global principles that are intended to prompt all kinds of businesses and organisations to monitor and act upon their climate change risks and opportunities, for example, in their investment portfolios, and then disclose what they're doing about those risks and opportunities publicly. The idea is to increase transparency and accountability around climate change risk and mitigation. Now, in the pension scheme space, it's proposed that these new duties will be rolled out to apply to larger occupational pension schemes and all authorised master trusts and collective DC schemes over a phasing in period. And I'll talk more about the timing and scope proposals in a moment. The proposals were first outlined to the pensions industry in a policy consultation that the DWP carried out in late summer and early autumn 2020. At Travers Smith, we responded to that policy consultation, and if you're interested in seeing our consultation response, you can find it on the pensions pages of the Sustainable Business Hub on our website, and I've put a link to the Sustainable Business Hub there on the slide. The government's conclusion from the policy consultation was that the proposals should broadly move ahead as originally planned, although they have made some changes in a couple of areas, and we'll flag some of those key changes as we go through this episode. Where we are now, in early March 2021, is that the government is currently consulting on the draft regulations and draft statutory guidance that will bring these proposals into law for pension trustees. This slide gives you a map which shows you the structure of the new legislation and how it works. At the top there, you can see the TCFD principles that I just mentioned a moment ago. Now, interestingly, the TCFD principles are generic and they're also voluntary, whereas by contrast, these proposals from the DWP will make the TCFD principles mandatory, and they'll be drafted in a way that is specific to occupational pension schemes. At the next level down, we have the Pension Schemes Act 2021, which, as I'm sure you know, recently received royal assent. The government has given itself a power under that act to issue new regulations requiring there to be effective governance of pension schemes in relation to climate change, and to set out what the government thinks effective governance looks like. And so from there, we come to the draft regulations that the government is now proposing to issue. The regulations will require trustees to do two main things. First of all, they'll be required to take substantive action in relation to climate change risk and opportunity. And then secondly, trustees will need to report on what they've done in a public way via something called an annual TCFD report, which will have to be put on a website and notified to both members and the pensions regulator. Now, in these episodes, we're going to be looking more at the substantive actions that are proposed for trustees. And if you look at the slide there, you can see that there are no less than 6 new duties being proposed. 3 ongoing duties around general governance, and that's what we're going to look at today. And then 3 more discrete duties around scenario analysis, metrics and targets, and that's what we'll look at in part 2. Now, as I mentioned, the regulations won't apply to all schemes, and they're being phased in over a period of time, with the largest occupational pension schemes and authorised master trusts and collective DC schemes going first. The timing rules can get slightly complicated, particularly for larger occupational pension schemes. The starting point is to look at the amount of a scheme's assets at the end of a scheme year. If an occupational pension scheme has relevant assets of £5 billion or more at the end of its first scheme year to end on or after the 1st of March 2020, then it's in the first wave for complying with these requirements, and the new duties will apply to that scheme starting from the 1st of October 2021, with a corresponding duty to produce the annual report relating to that date. For slightly smaller schemes, that is, schemes with relevant assets of £1 billion or more in the first scheme year to end on or after the 1st of March 2021, the duties and the reporting requirements will apply a year later. Schemes that are getting close to £1 billion of assets are going to have to continue to monitor their asset value at the end of each scheme year. If a scheme is below the threshold in 2021, but it goes over £1 billion of assets in a scheme year ending on or after the 1st of March 2022, then the general rule is that the trustees of that scheme will have to comply with the duties with effect from the next following scheme year. Now, in an important change since the policy consultation, the government has given some further thought about which assets do and don't count towards the relevant asset thresholds that I've just been talking about. What the government is now proposing is that bulk annuity contracts and also individual annuity contracts held by a scheme will be excluded when you test that asset threshold. And I think the rationale for that is that there is very little trustees can realistically do to change those sorts of assets where they've already entered into those sorts of contracts. So it's possible that large but very substantially de-risked schemes might find themselves outside the scope of these proposals after all. There have been some other minor but potentially helpful tweaks to these timing rules too, including around the dates at which you assess the different asset thresholds and removing long stop reporting dates for producing the annual TCFD report, which could have caused issues for schemes with years ending in the second half of the calendar year. There are also trapdoor provisions which cause these duties to fall away if a scheme's assets fall below £500 million. Now, there are some strings attached to those trapdoor conditions, and we don't have time to talk about them in detail today, but it's sensible to note that they are there in the proposals. For authorised master trusts and schemes providing collective DC benefits, the timing requirements are a little bit more straightforward, but they're very similar. The governance requirements will apply immediately as soon as the scheme already is or becomes an authorised master trust or CDC scheme on or after the 1st of October 2021. And there's a corresponding deadline for producing the annual TCFD report. There are also trapdoor provisions for these schemes which will cause the duties to fall away, but they're slightly different to the trapdoor provisions that apply for other kinds of occupational pension scheme. And in particular, there's an additional condition which relates to the authorisation status of the master trust or CDC scheme. So having introduced you to the context of the regulations and the proposal for their timing and scope, I'm now going to hand you over to Niamh Hamlin for the next part of the guide.
Thanks, Andy. So the first pillar of our ongoing duties is around having governance systems in place to oversee climate-related risks and opportunities affecting the scheme. And this involves supervising persons who are undertaking governance activities or advising on governance activities, but it doesn't include legal advisors. Sitting alongside this, we also then have a new knowledge and understanding requirement for trustees that will require them to have an understanding of the principles relating to the identification, assessment and management of climate change risks and opportunities for their scheme. So putting all of that into practice, we think this means three things. I think the starting point for all of this involves the trustees developing and maintaining a set of investment beliefs that factors in climate change. And this is where the new trustee knowledge and understanding requirements will come in. It's recognised that this is going to be very unfamiliar for lots of trustees, and it's also quite a technical area. So there will be a period for trustees that they will need to get up to speed. I think the second task for trustees is to look really closely at those who are involved in scheme governance, and set about defining their roles and responsibilities very clearly. I think communication is going to be really key. There's going to need to be an upfront investment of time and resource, and there may also be an exercise to update or tighten provider agreements to ensure that the right people are doing the right work and that the trustees can supervise them effectively. Now, I think this is an area where there's a bit of ambiguity still in the draft regulations, and it's not yet comprehensively answered in the guidance just how far these obligations extend, but we hope that we'll get a bit more clarity over time. What is clear, though, is that ultimate responsibility for complying with these duties lies with the trustees. So it's really important that trustees understand the information they're being given so that they can challenge it if needed. Lastly, trustees are going to make public disclosures about all of this. So this will mean setting out clearly who is doing the work, what they're doing, and how they're going about it. The second pillar of our ongoing duties relates to strategy, and this requires trustees to identify and assess the impact of climate-related risks and opportunities, which will have an effect over the short, medium, and the long term on the scheme's investment strategy, and for DB schemes, their funding strategy too. Now, we see this really as the crux of the new trustee duties, and this is the one that sort of draws together the outputs from some of the other duties, particularly the discrete duties around scenario analysis and adoption of metrics and targets, which Susie and Mike are going to talk about in a bit more detail in part 2 of this guide. Now, I think it's important to note that it's not the case that trustees are being required to invest in a particular way, but what they do need to do is to think actively about climate-related risks and opportunities in their own schemes. And the policy hope sort of underpinning all of this is that this will sort of help to usher in investment changes that will help with the transition, the wider transition to a low-carbon economy. Breaking down what this requires the trustees to do then, and looking first at funding strategy, it's very clear from the guidance that trustees will be expected to look closely at climate change risks as they relate to the employer covenant. Now, this is going to be easier for some employers and for some sectors than others. It's an area where the scenario analysis that trustees need to undertake is likely to help too. One point that does come out in the guidance and that trustees should have on their radar is that this will often involve them having confidential information about the sponsor. So they will need to just think carefully when they are making their own public disclosures about what goes into those. Also on funding strategy, I think the future of the future value of the scheme's assets is going to be a key consideration. And the climate-related impact on things like inflation, on interest rates, on demographic changes will also need to be taken into account, as they can obviously impact the value of scheme liabilities. All of this then feeds into a wider decision about the funding strategy and whether there is sufficient prudence in there to mitigate any climate change risks that have been identified. Taking investment strategy next, I think trustees are going to be expected to consider how different investments and how different investment approaches might be affected by the transition to a low carbon, climate resilient economy. And as part of that, I think trustees, judging by the guidance, they will need to look at all asset classes and the investment approaches they have in each of their portfolios. And I think helpfully, there is a recognition here that trustees are going to be reliant on their asset managers and their investment consultants to help with this. And the guidance talks in quite a lot of detail about what it describes as climate competence when selecting, reviewing and monitoring asset managers and investment consultants. Essentially, trustees need to be satisfied that their managers and consultants know their stuff when it comes to climate change investment risks, and they should have in place very clear objectives that they can use to monitor performance along the way. I think lastly, the draft regulations envisage that the trustees will carry out this analysis over the short, the medium and the long term. Now, obviously, these time horizons will mean different things for different schemes. And I think helpfully the draft regulations aren't prescriptive and they leave it up to trustees to decide what makes most sense for their own scheme. And there is some helpful guidance that discusses the factors that trustees can take into account when they are reaching a decision about that. Looking then at the third and final pillar of our ongoing duties, we have risk management. And this involves the trustees having processes in place to identify, assess and manage risk associated with transition to a low carbon economy, and then ensuring that it's integrated into sort of overall risk management. Now, there haven't been any changes in this area since the initial policy consultation, but what we do now have is a bit more detail in the guidance about what this will look like in practice. I think in terms of the approach that's expected of trustees, as well as thinking about the likelihood of certain risks materialising and the impact they might have on the scheme, trustees are also being encouraged to think about how vulnerable or how susceptible their own scheme is to a particular risk, and also how quickly their scheme might be impacted if a particular risk did materialise. In terms of what trustees should be looking at, I think risks should be considered at the asset class or at the sort of the key sector level, but it's open to trustees to sort of undertake a more granular analysis if they think that's what makes most sense for them. As we mentioned, trustees will be expected to integrate climate-related risks into their overall risk management. And a key point that's brought out in the draft guidance is that this should be done in a way that is proportionate to the other risks a scheme might face. And this is a point that we brought out in our response to last year's DWP consultation. And I think it's really helpful recognition that there are other risks that schemes may face out there besides climate risk, and climate risk may not be number one on the list. However, I think the key caveat here is this shouldn't be seen as a sort of get out of jail card, particularly for trustees who maybe are reluctant to invest the time and resources to get to grips with climate risk in their own schemes. And trustees will need to remember that if they do deviate from the guidance, they will need to be prepared to justify the approach they've taken and to explain why they've done something different. So I think the message for trustees is to get started with looking at their risk registers holistically and their other risk management processes, and start thinking about how climate risk can be integrated within those. I'm now going to hand over to Jonathan Gilmore, who is a partner in our finance team, and he is going to look at how some of the new duties we just talked about fit with the other changes we are seeing within the wider economy.
Thank you, Niamh. It's worthwhile noting that pension schemes, although they are being targeted first, aren't the only ones who will need to get up to speed with TCFD disclosures. When we were last presented with the proposals outlined in this consultation back in August, there was still uncertainty about how or whether the UK would implement wider ESG regulations coming down the track at the EU level, such as the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulations and the Taxonomy Regulation. We had some concerns that trustees of UK pension schemes would be doing one thing, while their asset managers and investee companies were doing something entirely different. We now know that these regulations, which are starting to come into force in the EU, were a casualty of Brexit in the UK, and they won't apply here in the UK. Instead, the government has a different and no less ambitious strategy to bring the majority of economic participants into the tent on ESG transparency and reporting in the near future. The UK's Joint Government Regulator TCFD Task Force published a roadmap in November of last year for the transition to mandatory fully aligned TCFD disclosures across the entire UK business and financial community by 2025. The roadmap represents the UK Task Force's flight path towards the implementation of climate-related disclosures in the financial and non-financial sectors, which are aligned with the TCFD's recommendations. The timeline for implementation differs depending on sectors, but UK pension schemes covered by the current consultation will be joined by premium listed companies and banks, building societies and insurance companies, and are expected to be subject to mandatory TCFD aligned disclosures by the end of this year. Other sectors, including the asset managers on whom trustees will largely rely for producing the data to perform their duties, which we'll speak about in our next episode, are expected to become subject to similar mandatory TCFD aligned disclosure obligations between now and 2025, most likely sometime late next year or early in 2023. All of this means that the trustees of the largest UK pension schemes will be leading the charge on what will eventually become mandatory across all sectors of the UK economy. This should over time lead to better disclosures by all entities and better information for trustees and their advisors to make climate change a factor in their investment decision-making processes, as these regulatory changes aim to do. Importantly, although it will be some time before the asset management community is required to undertake similar TCFD reporting to that undertaken by the largest UK pension schemes, you can be sure that many of those asset managers are already putting in place plans to ensure they can meet these obligations in the next couple of years. Now back to Andy to wrap up this episode.
So that brings us to the end of part 1. I hope you've enjoyed this bite-sized guide to some of the key ongoing features of the proposals. If you're looking for more resources on ESG and sustainability in pensions, then please do have a look at our Sustainable Business Hub. There's a link on the bottom of the slide there, but you can also search Travers Smith Sustainable Finance to get to the page. And of course, do feel free to get in touch with your usual Travers Smith contact if you have any comments or questions. Finally, please do join us again for part 2 of this bite-sized guide. We'll be looking at the proposals around scenario analysis, metrics and targets. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.